Just to start, it'd be good if you could just introduce yourself, who you are and where you're from, and then we'll open it for questions. Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. Mark Wilson, Executive Vice President, Chief Financial Officer of Aston Martin Lagonda.
Mike Halls, Chief Executive, Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders.
Patrick Keating, Government Affairs Manager at Honda Motor Europe.
The cars that you produce, Mr. Keating, in this country, and you produce other vehicles, motorcycles and other things around Europe, are they all registered? Is the authorisation all done in this country, or is it done in different countries?
It's done in different countries. So the vehicles which are manufactured at Swindon, at our factory here, are authorised by the VCA in the UK. As well as some small engined equipment, so marine engines and a few lawnmowers. Other products such as motorcycles and other power equipment which are manufactured in Europe, or items which are imported from Japan, have type approval from the Belgian authorities.
And if the VCA wasn't recognised in Europe after we leave the European Union, presumably your cars would have to get a different authorisation at point of sale or something else. Have you thought about how that might work and the additional costs as well involved?
There's two issues around that point. One is looking to the future, so new models that would come online. There we'd have to look to find a way to either work with the UK government to ensure that there's mutual recognition of any approvals issued by the UK government, but equally any approvals issued by European authorities should be recognised here, and that would allow us to continue to be placing vehicles on both markets with a single authorisation and a single set of testing procedures. However, if that mutual recognition doesn't come into place and there's some difficulty in managing that, then we'd have to look for contingency plans, which could either be moving that type of approval activity for those vehicles we sell into the EU to another European member state. However, the key issue is more in the short term, what happens to those vehicles that already are type approved? And there we would hopefully have a transitional period which would keep the same regulatory conditions as we have now, which would allow us to smoothly continue selling the existing models under the existing type approval into the European market, and equally bring those products in from Europe into the UK.
So are you saying, Mr. Keating, that cars that people own in European countries who have been authorised by the VCA, if we left without a deal, wouldn't be authorised anymore? And would that also then apply, not your problem perhaps, but would that also apply for cars in this country that had been authorised somewhere else other than the UK?
So cars currently on the market wouldn't be affected. It's a question of placing new models onto the market in the future.
Can I maybe add a bit of clarification to that? One of the issues is, the point you're getting at is you produce a vehicle for sale and it's type approved for the duration, the life cycle of that vehicle. So at the moment, if you were to take the certification out now, we know it is valid at least for as long as we're in Europe for the life cycle of that vehicle. If it got to the situation where the UK certification, the VCA certification, was no longer valid, you would have to seek an alternative approval. Now, there's two implications for that. You're not allowed to hold simultaneous approvals from two authorities. So effectively, you would have to stop production whilst you apply for your new certification and then start production again. And secondly, when you reapply under this new authority, you have to meet all the changes to regulation that have evolved from when you first got that vehicle certification. It may be the regulation has changed to such an extent you could not pass that regulatory framework.
And if I could square the circle, for Aston Martin it's far simpler than it is perhaps for Honda and some of the other larger international players. We're a British company. We produce our cars exclusively in Britain and will continue to do so. And without VCA type approval, it really is quite a stark picture for us. We need to make sure that that type approval carries over. It has validity and it has recognition and it has the equivalence that it has today. Otherwise, there are significant costs involved for us, not only in resourcing to another type approval, as Mike has indicated, but also the semi-catastrophic effects of having to stop production because we only produce cars in the UK.
Can you tell us, you say catastrophic, what would it mean in practice? Let's say we get to March 2019 and there isn't a deal, and I know that all your businesses are now beginning to prepare for that eventuality. You hope that it doesn't happen, but of course you have to prepare as businesses. What would that mean in March 29 if we didn't have a deal for your business, Aston Martin, in terms of those approvals? What would happen?
Well, it's difficult to say exactly, but the absolute example that Mike just gave of stopping production, recertifying to the new type approval, be that federal or the US or the Chinese type approval, even trying to retrospectively apply to use the European type approval, would mean us stopping our production. Now, I suppose we won't get there. I hope we won't get there, because that's exactly what it means for us. It would mean stopping production.
I wonder if I might ask some questions about why trading with the EU is important in the first place. Mr Wilson, you just spoke about need to see the shape and colour of the negotiations. Why is it important? So if I could ask Mike Hawkes first of all, could you talk to us in global numbers in terms of the size of the industry, number of units of value, and then perhaps each of you tell us about your individual businesses?
Sure. The automotive industry is export-led. We export just under 80%, certainly of the cars that we produce, and those cars are heavily integrated in terms of the supply chain with Europe. Now, if we export 80% of what we build, 56%, apologies for the numbers, 56% of that goes to the rest of the EU. That is about 4 times bigger than our nearest next market, which is the US, albeit the US is growing, as is Europe in terms of total market. So, we are very much, it is our primary market. It is also the primary market for imports. Around, again, 86% of vehicles that are sold in the UK come from abroad. The vast majority, essentially about 70%, come from the rest of the EU. So we're totally integrated in the European automotive industry, both in terms of markets for import, export and the supply chain.
And Aston Martin and Honda?
From our perspective, Europe is important in 2 key ways. So one, exports from our factory at Swindon, 35% are going into the EU 27 market, so that's an important export destination for us. Equally, in terms of imports of componentry into the Swindon factory, we're seeing 40% of the components we use at Swindon are sourced from the EU. Just to give a bit of colour on that, that's about 2 million components a day coming in on 350 trucks through the Eurotunnel. So again, that's why an arrangement around customs is particularly important to us. And then the third piece in terms of a future relationship is around people. Something around 14% of our workforce at the factory and around 30% of our workforce at our head office in Bracknell are EU 27 nationals.
Aston Martin?
Yeah, thank you. And it's about 18% of our sales are in Europe.
Sorry, what percentage?
About 18, 1/8. And about 25% in the UK, and the rest is international. And about 60% of our engineering and bill of material costs. So that is the design and development of the car in engineering terms is in the European supply base, and concurrently about 60% of the bill of materials that goes into building the car is sourced from European supply base. And just one more point as well, it's a semi-trade point, but also European talent. About 10% of our workforce is European, but it's a very highly skilled workforce. These are top-class engineers, aerodynamicists, vehicle dynamics engineers. The skill level is high, and we need to maintain access to that talent.
You touched earlier, Mike Hawes, on the issue of customs, and I think Patrick Keating in Honda's evidence to this select committee suggested that the non-tariff barriers might be even more serious than the tariff barriers. So perhaps, Patrick Keating, I could start with you, just explaining what impact customs controls would have on your business and ease of doing business.
Certainly, and it touches on the fact that we operate to just-in-time manufacturing, which is the most efficient way to run a plant. You order only what you need, it arrives when you need it, which reduces both waste and cost. As I was saying before, 40% of our componentry is sourced from the EU. On daily terms, that's about 2 million components coming in from the EU on 350 trucks through Eurotunnel and through the port of Dover. We hold line-side about 1 hour's worth of stock as part of that just-in-time production model. So we are keen to see, as we leave the customs union, a system put in place to ensure that friction or excessive friction does not come into place at the ports. So really that's about ensuring that the people, the infrastructure and the systems are in place early and well tested to ensure that as we leave the customs union on day 1 there isn't a huge amount of friction and blockage at the port. As I said, we see a period of about 18 months internally for us to be in a position to have the systems in terms of IT, personnel and systems in place to be able to manage the increased volume of customs work we're going to have to do. I know HMRC have calculated that they're seeing an increase of 50 million to 250 million transactions a year. So we're having conversations with HMRC to understand what it is that they're going to put in place and giving feedback on the customs partnership paper. When it comes to that, we're very happy that they've recognised that there is a need for transition, both from our side as businesses to put in place the countermeasures that we need, but equally on governments on both sides of the channel, they're going to need to make the investments in people and systems that are required as well.
In the evidence that you gave to us, Honda suggested that if custom controls added an extra 15 minutes, that would create costs of about £850,000 to your business.
Yes, so that's a calculation we've done in partnership with our freight companies, looking at what is the hourly cost for a truck, and that's extrapolated out to that figure on an annual basis. That's not a scientific figure, but that gives us a sense of the scale of the cost, and also indicates the fact that when it comes to calculating Brexit-related costs, it's not just tariffs. There are a lot of other little areas which can build up over time, and we need to take account of that.
If it was, say, 1 hour rather than 15 minutes, could we extrapolate that 850,000 times 4 is 3.4 million, or would that be wrong to do that?
That may be a rather unscientific way to approach it, and I think that the costs that would build up, we'd have to speak with the freight handlers and the trucking companies to understand how they would be managing and mitigating the costs as well. So that 850,000 is a quite back of an envelope calculation, just to give us a sense of what the additional costs we would be looking at. But obviously we'd be looking with our partners and our truckers to try and mitigate those costs as much as possible.
But if you were having to wait for a few hours at Dover or Ashford or wherever else things come in, you're talking of potentially millions of pounds.
Potentially, and I think at that point it would be looking at what other mitigations could be put in place. So when it comes to at least the short term around the border, we are, in terms of contingency planning, looking at the potential to invest in warehousing and holding stock on site, which is obviously moves away from just in time and is not a preferred option to take, because capital is tied up then in unproductive purposes.